Right, so it's one. Thank you all for joining. People are still coming in, but I'm going to get going. My name is Stephanie Fox from the Network One, and you have signed into one of our webinar Wednesdays. We have the rest of the team on the call. So we have Julian Boulding, Paul Squirrel, and Lizzie Gold. And we are all on hand if you have any questions or technical difficulties. So just message us in the chat. So just some very quick housekeeping before I introduce our speaker. I'll give a 5-minute introduction now. Our speaker will then talk for about 35 minutes. We'll have a 15-minute Q&A at the end, and we're aiming to finish at 1:55 London time, so you can all be ready for your next virtual appointment. Please do keep your microphones muted at all times. If we're calling you to ask a question, then feel free to unmute, but otherwise the background noise will really get in the way. That being said, do keep your videos on so our speaker has some nice friendly faces to talk to. As I mentioned, we'll have a Q&A portion at the end, but if you think of a question while our speaker is talking, you can send them directly to me via the chat box. So send it straight to me, not to everyone, because otherwise it will probably get lost. If you have any technical issues, you can message the team, or particularly Lizzie Gold, who is our tech guru. So you can either message her in the chat, or you can email Lizzie at lizzi.gold@thenetworkone.com. Currently recording this webinar, so no need to take any notes. And if for any reason the whole system crashes, just wait a couple of minutes and log back in with the same link that you used to log in just before. Thank you very much. So now I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker, Adrian Walcott, the founder of Brands with Values, a culture change company. Adrian is a multi-award-winning brand marketer with over 20 years experience, including senior leadership roles at Eurostar and Barclays. His company, Brands with Values, works with leading agencies in London, including Mediacom and Analog Folk, as well as corporates like Clyde and Vico and Clarion, and NGOs like the World Bank. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to hand over to Adrian.
Hello, everyone. Right, I'm going to try and share some slides and, oh, not that one. And then I look forward to having a conversation with you all. Can you see Hunter and Farmer?
Not yet, but I'm sure it will come up in a second. Oh, now it's gone. So maybe just try again. Okay, we're just waiting for it to load. That's weird. I can screen share on your behalf if you'd like me to.
Yeah, let's try one more time.
Okay.
If not, we will run with your suggestion. Okay. So.
Perfect. There we go.
Brilliant. So, really excited to talk to you guys today. And I'm going to talk to you about from hunter to farmer. So, from my perspective, when I was talking about how do we build brands from the inside out, I kind of felt you can't have that discussion without looking at culture, and you can't have a conversation around culture in this environment without talking about inclusion. And I think actually these things are very pertinent for you guys as agency owners, as advertisers on behalf of the brands that you represent. So I wanted to have a conversation with you today around business transformation or brand transformation and what that means for culture and what that means for inclusion. So I'm going to just share some of my perspectives with you and talk through some of the ways in which we are farming, as I'll come on to explain in a moment, to help people build meaningful and sustainable cultures. So let me give you my perspective. The first point around discussion that I want to talk about in terms of inclusion is my personal perspective around racism, right? As you can see in the text that we have here. Now, what I find interesting about the way we approach this particular topic is there's an assumption that actually it's about fixing a group of people, fixing a group of anybody, including people that look like me. Now, the challenge around that is not all Black people are the same, right? In fact, a lot of people are very, very different. And the things that drive people and their motivations can be linked to their values, which is what you can see, obviously, in this particular story. And I think the trick to build brands from the inside out is to really understand what people's motivations are and what their drivers are. So when it comes to driving inclusion or creating an aligned culture, you really can't do that if you group people together. So from an inclusion perspective, there really is no silver bullet into fixing inclusion and creating inclusive cultures. And when I look at my own story around my own experience, there's times when I felt like both in all of these states, I felt like a minority. I felt like I'm in the majority. And I've also had periods where I feel like I'm in the minority. And let me explain a bit more around what I mean about that. And I'm going to bring it together around what that means for agencies, what that means for culture, and what that means for inclusion. But when I talk about periods of being a minority, it harks back to my story around navigating my way into the industry. Now, I was fortunate to work at WPP as my first job, but it was quite difficult getting there. So I grew up in London in social housing, and I struggled at school and felt pretty disconnected throughout that period. And then there came a time where I kind of got my head down, got lucky, and I got into a great Russell Group university, and I ended up finishing with a politics and economics degree. But that feeling of feeling like an outsider for me came when, having worked so hard to get that degree, finding it very difficult to get into the creative industry. I applied many places without success. So actually I took it upon myself to literally, I picked up 2 suitcases and I went to Africa, where I'd never been before, went to Ghana specifically, and had a period that I felt on the inside. Now, before I get to that, when I got to Ghana, I met someone who knew someone who knew someone, and that person was the CEO for Ogilvy Africa. And they gave me an opportunity. And they gave me an opportunity to get into the industry. And it was fascinating because not only was I able to learn about my craft around TV, radio, press, and outdoor, I actually lived in a majority. I saw people that looked like me. I saw individuals in running organizations and lots of stuff that inspired me, which is a very different existence than the one I had sort of growing up in England before going out to Africa, where I would spend 2 years honing my craft in an industry that I loved. So having spent a couple of years doing that, by the time I got back to the UK, I was probably one of the most experienced marketeers of my age. And that led me to get into a really great organization. I got into Barclays, which at the time was a great place to be able to get into to fulfill my marketing career, where I worked in various roles, from campaign management across Premier and branding, across Premier, retail, private and corporate. And actually, I had a lot of confidence at that time because I knew so much and my experience was very well accepted. But what happened was, I didn't understand how it worked. I didn't understand the culture. I didn't understand how to unlock it. And I started to find that I was going onwards and sidewards, and some of my counterparts were going onwards and upwards. And that wasn't because I didn't have the aptitude and the experience, but I didn't know how things worked. And to cut a long story short, it was only a chap who's now our chairman, who at the time was the CEO for the retail bank with a team of 30,000 people reporting to him. He became my mentor and he helped me unlock the matrix, as it were. And therefore, that feeling of being in a minority and not feeling quite disconnected changed. But why do I tell you all this? Why am I telling this story about what does this mean for corporate culture? What does it mean for agency culture and for the teams that you lead? I tell you that story because that feeling of being on the majority or being on the inside looking out or being on the outside looking in is the experience that I believe all employees have in organizations. Now, it might not necessarily be down to stuff around race and ethnicity and so on and so forth. People feel connected and disconnected because they don't connect to the organizational purpose. They don't connect to the values of the organization. Some people feel like they're really in tune with the journey that the organization is going in. And sometimes it's about leadership. So that means when it comes to looking at stuff like diversity, inclusion, this for me is a transformation program. A transformation program no different to digital or brand transformation. And the thing here, to lead into these things well, you really need to understand the motivations and the drivers of people that sit within the business. And if I focus on inclusion and diversity, which I think is probably the most emotionally charged transformation program there is, what I find interesting in the way that people approach solutions around inclusion and diversity, and in many ways similar to what they did in digital transformation and in brand building, is people take a hunting mentality. So when you look at digital transformation and you look at what's happened in recent years, a lot of CEOs across the FTSE 100 went to Silicon Valley, looked at the stuff that they were doing, came back, brought it into their organization. Yeah, in the financial services industry, that means you could wear chinos and you don't need to wear a tie and things like that. In the inclusion industry, you know, that has been unconscious bias training or finding that elusive person of color to sit in a senior manager role and so on and so forth. And just generally looking around Harvard Business Review to find out, you know, what that tactical thing could be that can help drive an inclusion, or actually what that tactical thing can be to drive digital transformation. And actually, to drive transformation from the inside out, be it inclusion, or be it digital, or be it trying to reimagine a purpose for your business or your brand, I really don't believe it's about hunting the solution like that. I think it's about taking a farmer's approach to driving inclusion or driving digital transformation. And what I mean by that is really trying to understand the ecosystem that sits within your organization. So the ecosystem, that living organism that creates the culture, be it inclusive or not, and is the source as brand builders, is part of the fact base in trying to create purpose for the brands that you represent. And that farmer's bit for me is in the way that they spend a lot of time trying to understand the soil composition that allow myriad flowers to grow, is what's crucial within your organizations to allow, likewise, people to evolve. And when it comes to things like representation, it's about creating an inclusive culture that people feel that they can bring their whole selves to work. And that's about really understanding the ecosystem. Now, that's where we spend our time. And we do it in quite a deep and quite a forensic way in the way we decode culture for organizations around the world. And the source of how we farm or understand the soil compositions is by having a forensic understanding of what drives human beings and their motivations. And those motivations are driven by their values. And those values are manifested in the way we communicate and the way we behave. So in organizations, agencies, culture is the summation of people interacting, and that therefore becomes the de facto culture. And when leaders put policies, programs, procedures, and bestow them on their organizations, that then informs the way people communicate and behave, which again is linked to values. And that for us is the deep, richer opportunity to understand your culture, so then you can use it to make or create more meaningful and more sustainable workplaces. Now, we do that through this 3-word wall, 8 minutes culture and inclusion decoder, where we are triangulating 3 things to really get under the skin of the culture. And we are triangulating the personal values of what drives people, what gets people out of bed in the morning. And we are triangulating that with what people observe. So for all the policies, programs, and procedures bestowed on an organization, what is the takeout coupled with what people desire? And we are cutting that by ethnicity, by sexual orientation, by geography, by department, by tenure, by age. And that's allowing us to have a real forensic understanding of what the culture's doing, which I think is critical for trying to create a more inclusive workplace. And I think it's also critical for brand building, because the external representation of the brand needs to be manifested internally. And what I've seen and what I've experienced as a marketeer is a lot of building brands from the inside out can be focused on what makes us different from our competitors, what makes us relevant to our consumers. But in a service-based business, and we learned this in the big organizations I worked with, the brand are the people that are serving customers every day. And to really align them around that brand or that external point of view can only really happen if you forensically know what is happening under the bonnet. And it's that farmer's mentality that allows for richer brand building and for improved ways of driving inclusion. Now, so from my point of view, operating as farmers and having deep understanding of the internal audience then allows us to make smarter decisions around how we build brands so that they have greater cut through, and obviously they get greater authentic connection with the employees that sit behind them. And equally, from an inclusion perspective, rather than blanket bombing the organization with things like unconscious bias training and putting everybody through it, actually having a forensic understanding of the culture in terms of what it looks like from a global perspective and what it means in every constituency, will then help you think about how you deliver that change in a meaningful and sustainable way. And it also allows for, if you're serious about driving representation, if you're creating a culture where you're on a path to drive of inclusion and those behaviors, it means that people generally feel that they can get to the top of their organization. And what it also means is you avoid own goals. Yeah. And in the creative industry, what I find interesting as a marketeer who spent sort of 20 years in the industry and know intrinsically the process one goes through from idea to execution to purchasing media to display, I find it interesting that within these campaigns, and apologies if anyone on the calls worked on these, but my assumption is either there is nobody of color was involved in the process, and there would have been quite a few people in delivering these. And what's worse, if there were people of color in the process, they didn't feel it was the culture in which they could sort of speak up and contribute. And my point is, having a greater understanding of your culture and the drivers not only helps you move away and avoid own goals, it also lines you up for success, because invariably you'll have a greater sense of what drives people. So if I kind of summarize where I net out in creating more sustainable and meaningful change, be it brand transformation or be it inclusion and diversity, I think there's a real opportunity not to just hunt around for various solutions that you can land in your organization, but look more deeply within your agencies, understand what the culture's doing intrinsically, so you can bring people on a change in a meaningful and sustainable way. And invariably, when you are building brands for your clients, yes, we must use the fact base of how we're different from our competitors and how relevant we are for consumers, but really shine a mirror internally on the employees, particularly in a service-based business, who are delivering that proposition every day. Because if they don't feel like they are connected to it, equally, they don't feel engaged within the business, be it due to not connecting the disconnected, then you'll find that actually it will have quite serious implications for your wider KPIs. So for me, it's about, broadly speaking, acting less like hunters and firmly approaching and deploying the techniques of farmers in cultivating your culture. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, we've had a few questions come in, so I'm going to get right stuck into those. So someone has asked, is achieving a diverse but aligned culture more challenging in a big organization or in a smaller one? Thinking of agencies, for example.
I think the sheer scale in terms of trying to deliver inclusion and diversity has wider implications for larger organizations. But at the same time, there's certain things that exist in any size. So one of the biggest things that can stop an organization from being inclusive and diverse is toxicity. And that's not really size dependent. So when we are running our culture decoder in organizations and we are looking at the aspects around toxicity, that can be a real alarm bell. So for us, there's kind of a Maslow hierarchy of needs to driving change and driving inclusion. And actually, toxicity is one of them. And that is not really dependent upon size. I think equally, the other area, which again is not size dependent, is around personal values. So if you've got people who are not share the same vision, normally between leaders and the rest of their employees, that can have implications in getting people to lean in and getting them to deliver greater discretionary effort. And then the final one, again, not dependent on size, can be direction of travel. So if leadership and the rest of the organization have got different views on the direction of travel for the future, that can have implications for creating an inclusive, happy and productive culture. So I think, I suppose size is not a differential in the things that you can pull out, but obviously the scale can make it harder when it comes to the remedial actions that you will need to drive change in a sustainable and meaningful way.
That makes sense. Thank you. So we've had another question in the chat. Someone has said, who, excuse me, who uses the culture decoder? Obviously a company looking at itself, but is it used by outsiders? For example, someone deciding whether to buy another company or merge with them?
Well, that's a great question. We do a lot of work in this space because one of the things that's been apparent is that culture clash is one of the biggest reasons why deals fall over. So when it comes to acquiring other companies, it always looks good on paper from a rational sense. And there's often cost savings to be had. And also there's the opportunity there to then think about how you can use the opportunity to drive shareholder value. However, and in that process, a lot of legal due diligence is done, financial due diligence is done. But what people don't always think about is the people plan. And actually the people is the most crucial part, people integration. So we end up using the tool quite a lot to de-risk the people integration piece so that the person leading the integration has got a sense of the drivers of the different audiences in terms of who they are, in terms of what they currently experience in their different organizations and what they desire. And we're able to give pointers to organizations so they can, in quite a systematic way, build a roadmap so that people do extract the value out of the mergers and acquisitions. In fact, events can be a lot of the drivers for why people are using our culture decoder. Another driver can be around new CEOs or new MDs coming in with a task to lead their agencies and actually want to bring people with them. So actually start by understanding almost in their first 90 days what the culture's doing and what it means for their strategic plan for moving their agency in new directions. So that can be a reason. And in fact, the other biggest reason why a lot of people have been thinking about the culture is because the world has been through the biggest change and challenges ever experienced through COVID. And actually the fact that people are now working from their living rooms, the fact that stuff like BLM has had a personal impact on how people view the world and their personal values. It means there's this moment now as we kind of start to move back into the workplace to start to think about how do I build the culture of the organization for the future? And that's about giving people an opportunity to co-create that by sharing their views, sharing what they currently see and what they desire. So there's a lot of, shall we say, natural migration to this elusive term around culture. Because I think prior to COVID-19, you would talk to organizations about culture and people say, yeah, well, we're generally doing okay. We're winning new clients. The team seem okay, or we're really small, so we know the culture. Anyone can narrate it if asked. But I think these things that have affected the global ecosystem now, from our perspective, make it clearer than ever that people believe that culture does eat strategy for breakfast. So that famous Peter Drucker quote, I think, is now perceived as real, and people are actively trying to operate in this space.
Thank you very much. That's really helpful. Another question's come in. In your experience, what causes the biggest resistance to culture change in a business?
There are many, but the one that I think is the most crucial one, which stops culture change happening in the business, regardless of any size, is when a leadership say one thing and do another by the programs and the policies and the things they put into place. In fact, no different to kind of from a brand consumer perspective, right? When a brand says it's about something, but the experience by the consumer is something else, and then people then fall out of love with that brand. That same emotion or that same disappointment or that same mistrust is what happens internally within organizations when leaders say they're about something and they don't role model, or they put things in place which are different. That is probably singly the most important thing that can derail a culture change from happening. And I think the other one, which is in a sort of one in the same, or in the same sort of ballpark, is this toxicity piece. Because I think I may have mentioned that there is a kind of Maslow hierarchy that needs to drive in change. And if at the baseline there's toxicity in your culture, you can't begin to lean into anything. That's what I find fascinating about inclusion and diversity, or when organizations talk about digital transformation, or they talk about driving sustainability. All of those things can only happen if you have a firm baseline. And that firm baseline has to be the real reduction in toxicity. So if your organization is massively hierarchical, hugely demanding, long hours, confusing, challenging, all of these things make it difficult to deliver on those agendas, which is why if I kind of think about that hunter-farmer piece we were just discussing, I think that's the watch point around not being seduced by all these things that people are told. Well, if I have a well-being offer, I'll have a great culture. If I have an inclusion offer, I'll have well, no, you won't. You'll only have it's much deeper than that. You'll have a great culture if you can understand the ecosystem with which you're operating in forensically. And for us, the currency for understanding culture forensically is having your arms around values. And I don't mean that stuff that sits on walls or that stuff that people talk about in their performance review. I'm talking about there's a human value system, a circular value system that's sitting us as human beings. And indeed, that is the premise for our culture decoder. It was based on the writings or the academic of a chap called Shalom Schwartz, who said there's a circular value system that sits within us. And that's what our tool is using to decode and understand what's going on. Probably should have said that earlier on. We haven't just made this up. Yeah. This is based on Shalom Schwartz doing research in over 200 countries. And his writing is cited in about 4,000 articles. And it's the rigorous testing and unpacking of that sits behind our culture decoder.
Brilliant. Thank you. Another question, does being a farmer rather than a hunter imply that healthy, diverse culture is built from bottom up rather than top down?
Yes, another great question. I think the questions are allowing or showing the gaps in my presentation, one of the two. But you are absolutely spot on with that. That's the whole point. My whole point around inclusion is what I see there are people who are trying to be on the right and the wrong side of history, right, which is another debate in itself. And I think people are looking and seduced by these solutions, either hunting them in Harvard Business Review or coming across them, and then busy wanting to be seen to be doing something, and therefore they then manifest in a training or asking me to come and talk at Black History Month, whereas actually, that's not how you drive inclusion in a meaningful and sustainable way. But you can drive it bottom up by farming. Because if you farm, you then get to understand whether you're a team of 50 or a team of 100, you understand an ecosystem as a living organism. So, and in culture terms, that living organism is a summation of people communicating and behaving and speaking. And that's the bit that once you understand it and you see whether the behaviors in that ecosystem lend themselves to the things that you need for inclusion, such as curiosity, innovation, creativity, adventure, or caring for others, selflessness, community, collaborate. You need to create all of those things in your organization. And then it allows for, when you bring in young people or people from a different background, they can genuinely feel that they can start in your organization and get to the top. And your commitment should be to making sure that you are always creating an inclusive culture. And that way it can be from the bottom, right and you can get there right the way to the top. Whereas at the moment, because of the way in which people are leaning into this agenda, you find a lot of people coming in from different backgrounds, only to find that they are impacted by the squeezed middle, and they end up leaving because, or sometimes they get to the top and people don't survive what they're calling the glass cliff, because it looks good because you've got people of difference in your organization, but you've not created the culture that allows them to survive and thrive. And the opposite happens, they end up leaving. So your numbers look good because you can report better data, but it becomes short term because you end up creating, it can be disconcerting for those people flying that flag, and they end up moving on. And then your investment in them then becomes, a kind of a wasted investment, and it has a negative impact on everybody concerned. So it is about creating a bottom-up culture.
That makes
Absolutely.
sense. Thank you. So we've had a couple of questions in which people sort of want to know a company that you've worked with that has done this well, or if there are any companies you can say that you think culture wash. If you don't want to share anyone, maybe someone from the audience would like to share their own experience of maybe dealing with the challenges of a non-inclusive culture or leading cultural change. So if you want to share, go ahead, but if not, maybe we'll see if anyone in the audience can.
Yeah, but I'm happy to give it a try. But can I ask to hear your question again, please?
Sure. So one person said, can you give an example of a company you've worked with that has been successful in this, and how did they do it? And similar question said, in your view, which companies have really got to grips with the issues of culture and are role models, and equally who culture washes, if you can say?
Yeah, I think it's I never single out people that we work with
Understandable.
for good reasons. But what I would say is the people that are getting it right understand that this is about mind shift work. So when I say about mind shift work, I'm talking about changing mindsets. So if you want to create a more inclusive culture or lead into sustainability, that is about changing mindsets. The people who understand that and are then using data like ours and then deploying coaches, executive coaches, and doing sort of deep education, group work, conflict resolution, those are the people that are getting it right. The people that are continuing to not get as far as they could are the ones who are approaching this in a rational sense. So they're looking at process re-engineering, right? So, or changing policy. You change a policy, you change a process, you change a procedure, you enact a program. It's all immaterial if you're not able to change mindsets, particularly if the mindset shift is needed at a senior level. So what I mean by that, it's very easy for me to be on trend and say, I tell you what, I'm going to get me one of these well-being programs. But that's not great if I decide that I'm not going to go to a meeting or whatever because I have a Reiki or whatever I'm doing. If the board don't respect that, then actually that doesn't help my cause. So it's within there and I can use it. You can talk about it. But if the mind shift is, well, you know, I've just got that in there because it's on trend. But from a mindset point of view, you know, our board is quite traditional. We're less open to new things and we are just driven by the numbers. Then me going off and doing my bit of well-being in the middle of the day is not going to help my career trajectory in that organization, because the mind shift is not one in which is open to these kinds of things. So that's why I said the ones that are getting it right who do understand that when they're working and trying to drive culture change in businesses or brands or big organizations, they understand that in order to do it well, they need to understand the mindsets of globally and in every constituency, so they can then start to do remedial work, which taps into changing that, as opposed to flicking policies around and hoping that it delivers the change that we all want to see.
Perfect. Thank you. Really helpful. I'm not sure if anyone is going to want to share an example, but if anyone does fancy sharing an example of how you've dealt with these issues, please do feel free and just unmute yourself and jump straight in, or otherwise we'll carry on with the questions. So I'll give you a couple of moments. Okay, that's totally fine. We've got some more questions. So yeah, hopefully this will be food for thought and people will be able to apply all these learnings, and then next time they'll have lots of great examples. So another question, agencies often make a lot about their culture, but in your experience, do you think they really understand what's involved in building a strong culture? And when they say agencies, they're talking, mostly advertising and marketing people.
That's an interesting one. I think increasingly, yes. I think increasingly that is the case. I think if I go back to when I was in agency, this was a long time ago now, it was almost, you're lucky to be a part of this amazing thing. And I think, there was a lot of, it was a different era. I think agencies are smart people. They are people that are agile. They see what's happening around them and they lean into it. And I think agencies increasingly understand that culture is now more important than ever. And I think that is changing agencies' approach in a good way. And I think also it's helping them with their clients, yeah, and also understanding the greater role that agencies have in shaping society. And I think with that responsibility, you're getting a newer response. Will be my view, and I think that's just set to continue. I do think the pressures still remain with agencies in terms of driving revenue, smaller margins, the retention, the time in which agencies can retain clients are dwindling, and so on and so forth. So they do that in a vacuum where things are changing and things are quite tough. But having said all of that, I think agencies also understand that all they have is their people. So they've got their badge and their people are the differentiator. And the agencies that are very successful, winning all the awards and continuing to show leadership, are the ones that understand that they need to invest in their people, in their culture to stay ahead. So that will be my answer from the outside looking in.
That's very true. Thank you. So we've just got time for a couple more questions. So if anyone else does have one, please send them to me in the chat. I've had one more here. Companies used to talk more about having a distinctive culture, a P&G type person or a McCann type person. Are diversity and distinctiveness inherently opposites that need to be balanced, or a choice that needs to be made?
Yeah, that's a great question. A really great question. I mean, you got my mind going in all sorts of different ways on that question. So here's how I think I'm going to answer that question. From my perspective, we are all human, first and foremost. And the fact that we're all human means that we all share values. And from my perspective, values transcend race, they transcend sexual orientation, they transcend gender, and so on and so forth. So I do believe within the sort of confines of a P&G type person and a McCann type person, within that construct, I do believe there is the opportunity for have a diverse bunch within that construct, which allows therefore people from different backgrounds to operate within the, shall we say, the confines of the construct of what makes a McCann or a P&G type person. So that, I think, absolutely allows for that to happen.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I think that we are just about out of time for questions. Just having a look through if there are any very quick ones we can include. But I mean, it's 1:45 now and we're pretty much out of time. So I just want to say a really massive thank you, Adrian. That was great. And I'm sure you've got all of our cogs working as well. What I'm going to do is share your details in case anyone would like to contact you with any follow-up questions that maybe they were too shy to share. So if you'd like to speak to Adrian, his email address is adrian.w@brandswithvalues.com. And you can find out more about Brands with Values on their website, which is brands.withvalues.com. So thank you guys, everyone, for joining us. If you enjoyed the content of this webinar, which hopefully you did, you'll maybe have heard about our new leadership seminar that we have coming up called Winning Agency Culture. So this is all about how to, create a really great agency culture that helps you retain your talent and also win new clients as well. So I'm going to post the link in the chat now. It is for agency CEOs and leaders. So please do feel free to sign up for that if you would like to. And you can also find more info about it on the Eventbrite page as well. Oh, sorry, I see my colleague Julian has just put that in the chat, so thank you. So yeah, another huge thank you to Adrian, and thank you very much for everyone for coming. Our next webinar Wednesday will be held on the 9th of June, and the title is From Freud to Frozen Peas, the psychology behind more effective creative and increased sales revenue. Our speaker is Dr. Simon Moore. He's a chartered psychologist and managing partner with the award-winning UK-based psychological insight and behavior intervention consultancy, Innovation Bubble. We'll be posting the registration link in the chat now. I'm just going to go ahead and do that. So do feel free to register for that one as well. So if you would like to see recordings from both this webinar and our past webinars, you can go to www.thenetwork1.com/webinars. And if you'd like to be on our mailing list to find out about future webinars and events, you can email me. My email address is stephanie.fox@thenetwork1.com. So thank you guys for joining us. Thank you, Adrian, and enjoy the rest of the day. And we will be sending the recording as soon as it's ready. Speak to you all soon. Bye.
Bye.